Part 6 of The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal. The dying man told me of his time in occupied Poland, mentioning a place. Was it Reichkov? I didn't ask. Why the long prelude? Why didn't he say what he wanted from me? There was no necessity to break it so gently. Now his hand began to tremble, and I took the opportunity to withdraw mine. But he clutched it again and whispered, "Please." Did he want to fortify himself or me for what was to come? And then came the terrible thing. But first I must tell you a little more about myself. He seemed to detect my uneasiness. Had he noticed I was watching the door? For suddenly he said, "No one will come in. The nurse wanted to and promised to keep watch out there." Heinz, my schoolmate, who was with me in Poland too, always called me a dreamer. I didn't really know why, perhaps because I was always merry and happy, he said. At least until that day came, and it happened. It's a good thing that Heinz cannot hear me now. My mother must never know what I did. She must not lose her image of a good son. That is what she always called me. She must always see me as she wanted to see me. She used to read my letters out to all the neighbours, and the neighbours said that they were proud I got my wound fighting for the Führer and the fatherland. You know the usual phrase. His voice grew bitter, as if he wanted to hurt himself, give himself pain. In my mother's memory, I am still a happy boy, without a care in the world, full of high spirits. Oh, the jokes we used to play. As he recalled his youth and comrades, I too thought back on the years when practical jokes were a hobby of mine. I thought of my old friends, my schoolmates in Prague. We had many a joke together, we who were young with life stretching before us. But what had my youth in common with his? Were we not from different worlds? Where were the friends of my world? Still in camp or already in a nameless mass grave? And where are his friends? They are alive, or at least they have a sunflower on their graves and a cross with their name on it. Now I began to ask myself why a Jew must listen to the confession of a dying Nazi soldier. If he had really rediscovered his faith in Christianity, then a priest should have been sent for. A priest who could help him die in peace. If I were dying, to whom should I make my confession? If indeed I had anything at all to confess. And anyway, I would not have had as much time as this man had. My end would be violent, as it happened to millions before me. Perhaps it would be an unexpected surprise. Perhaps I would have no time to prepare for the bullet. He was still talking about his youth as if we were reading out aloud, and the only effect was that it made me think of my youth too. But it was so far away that it seemed unreal. It seemed as if I had always been in prison camps, as though I were born merely to be maltreated by beasts in human shape, who wanted to work off their frustrations and racial hatred in defenseless victims. Remembrance of a time past only made me feel weak, and I badly needed to remain strong, for only the strong in these dire times had a hope of survival. I still clung to the belief that the world one day would revenge itself of these brutes, in spite of their victories, their jubilation, and all the battles they had won, and their boundless arrogance. The day would surely come when Nazis would hang their heads as the Jews do now. All my instincts were against continuing to listen to this deathbed disavowal. I wanted to get away. The dying man must have felt this. for he dropped the letter and groped for my arm. The movement was so pathetically helpless that all of a sudden I felt sorry for him. I would stay, although I wanted to go. Quietly, he continued talking. Last spring, we saw that something was afoot. We were told time after time we must be prepared to do great things. Each of us must show himself a man. He must be tough. There was no place for humanitarian nonsense. The Führer needed real men. That made a great impression on us at the time. When the war with Russia began, we listened over the radio to a speech by Himmler before we marched out. He spoke of the final victory of the Führer's mission, on the smoking out of subhumans. We were given piles of literature about Jews and Bolsheviks. We devoured the Sturmer and many cut caricatures from it and pinned them above our beds. But that was not the sort of thing I cared for. In the evenings, the canteen grew heated with beer talk and Germany's future. As in Poland, the war with Russia would be a lightning campaign, thanks to the genius of our leader. Our frontiers would be pushed further and further eastward. The German people needed room to live. For a moment he stopped as though exhausted, and then continued. You can see for yourself on what sort of career my life was launched. He was sorry for himself. His words were bitter and resigned. I again looked through the window and perceived that the boundary between light and shadow was now above the other windows of the inner facade. The sun had climbed higher. One of the windows caught the sun's rays and reflected them as if it was closed again. For a moment the flash of light looked like a heliograph signal. At that time we were ready to see symbols in everything. It was a time of rife mysticism and superstition. Often my fellow prisoners in the camp told ghost stories. Everything for us was unreal and unsubstantial. The earth was peopled with mystical shapes. God was on leave, and in his absence, others had taken over to give us signs and hints. In normal times, we would have laughed at anybody who believed in supernatural powers. But nowadays we expected them to intervene in the course of events. We devoured every word spoken by alleged soothsayers and fortune tellers. We often clung to completely nonsensical interpretations, if only they gave us a ray of hope for better times. The eternal optimism of the Jew surpassed all reason, but now even reason was out of place. What in this Nazi world was reasonable and logical? You lost yourself in fantasy merely in order to escape from the appalling truth, and in such circumstances reason would have been a barrier. We escaped into dreams and we didn't want to awake from those dreams. I forgot for a moment where I was, and then I heard a buzzing sound. A blue bottle, probably attracted by the smell, flew around the head of the dying man, who could not see it, nor could hear or see me wave it away. Thanks, he nevertheless whispered, and for the first time I realized that I, a defenseless subhuman, had contrived to lighten the lot of an equally defenseless Superman, without thinking, simply as a matter of course. His narration proceeded. At the end of June, we joined a unit of stormtroops and were taken to the front in trucks. We drove past vast fields of wheat which stretched as far as the eye could see. Our platoon leader said Hitler had intentionally started the campaign at that time against Russia, which would enable us to bring in the harvest. We thought that clever. On our endless journey, we saw by the wayside dead Russians, burnt-out tanks, broken down trucks, dead horses, and there were wounded Russians too, lying there helpless, with nobody to care for them. All the way we could hear their screams and groans. One of my comrades spat at them, and I protested. He simply replied with a phrase that our officer had used: "No pity for Ivan." His words sounded like a sober military command. He spoke in the style of a war correspondent. His words were prototype, unthinking. His conversation was full of stupid phrases which he had taken from newspapers. Finally, we came to a Ukrainian village, and here I had my first contact with the enemy. We shot up a deserted farmhouse in which Russians had barricaded themselves. When we stormed in, we found only a few wounded men lying about, with whom we didn't bother. That is, I didn't bother. But our platoon leader gave them the coup de grace. Since I have been in hospital here, these details constantly recur to me. I live it over and over again, but much more precisely and vividly. Now I have plenty of time to do so. The fighting was inhuman. Many of us could hardly stand it. When our major saw this, he shouted at us, "Believe you me, don't you think the Russians act differently toward our men? You need only to see how they treat their own people. The prisons we come across are full of murdered men. They simply mow down their prisoners when they cannot take them away. He who has been selected to make history cannot be bothered with such trifles." One evening, a comrade took me aside in order to express his horror, but after the very first sentence he stopped. He didn't trust me. We continued to make history. Day after day, we heard victory reports, and constantly we were told that the war would soon be over. Hitler said to Himmler, "For me, it is now really over." He then took a deep breath and a sip of water. Behind me, I heard a noise and looked around. I had not noticed that the door was open, but he had heard it. "Sister, please." "All right," she said. "I only wanted to look around." She shut the door again. He continued. "One hot summer day we came to Droppenskoft. Everywhere there was abandoned cars and guns, many of them still intact. Obviously the Russians had left in great haste. Houses were burning and the streets were blocked with hastily erected barricades. But there was nobody left to defend them. There were deaths among the civilians. On the pavement, I saw the body of a woman, and over her crouched 2 weeping children. Well, we will continue next week. Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.